The forest pulsed with life beneath the blood-stained moon. Shadows stretched like grasping fingers through the trees, and the night carried the scent of damp earth, old secrets, and something far sweeter, something forbidden. Cale moved through the darkness like a phantom, his massive frame cutting through the mist with effortless grace. The beast within him prowled restlessly, stirring beneath his skin, urging him forward. His golden eyes, sharp as a hunter's blade, burned with hunger, not the kind that could be sated by flesh or blood. No, this was something deeper, something primal. Then he saw her. Celine stood at the heart of the ruins, her silver hair cascading over her shoulders, catching the moonlight like spun starlight. Her gown, deep crimson like the first bite of twilight, clung to her form, the delicate fabric shimmering with the faintest hint of sweat. A vampire should not overheat. A vampire should not tremble beneath the weight of an invisible fire. Yet there she was, breathing heavily, her ivory skin tinged with a feverish flush. Cale's breath came rough through his teeth. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to lunge, to claim. She was the enemy, the cold-blooded parasite his kind had hunted for centuries. And yet, something in the way she stood, vulnerable yet unbroken, sent a jolt of raw need through his veins. Celine turned her head, slow and deliberate, her piercing violet eyes locking onto his. "You've been watching me." Her voice was like silk dragged over steel, smooth yet edged with danger. Cale stepped forward, muscles rippling beneath the dark leather straps across his chest. "You knew I was here." It wasn't a question. They had both felt the pull, like the tide answering the call of the moon. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "I did." His hands curled into fists, nails biting into his palms. "Then why didn't you run?" Celine tilted her head, the movement both elegant and calculated. "Would you have let me?" A growl rumbled in his chest, deep and possessive. The air between them thickened, charged with something volatile, something neither of them could control. She took a step closer. The scent of her, intoxicating and laced with something unnatural, filled his lungs. His jaw clenched. He had imagined vampires as ice and shadow, creatures of the void that devoured without mercy. But Celine burned. She radiated a heat that made his skin itch, his muscles coil, his thoughts blur with forbidden desire. Her fingers drifted to her throat, tracing a bead of sweat rolling down her porcelain skin. "It's strange," she murmured, almost to herself. "I don't feel like myself." Cale watched the movement with a dark, unreadable gaze. "You're burning up." Her violet eyes flickered with something dangerous. "And yet, I've never felt more alive." The words sent a pulse of raw heat through his veins. Every nerve in his body screamed at him to act, to take, to claim what was standing so recklessly close. Celine lifted a hand, her cool fingers grazing his jaw, testing, tempting. "What are you afraid of, Wolf?" Cale's control snapped like a thread stretched too thin. In an instant, he had her against the crumbling stone wall. His hands braced on either side of her head, his breath hot against her ear. She gasped, whether in fear or something darker. She didn't say. "I fear nothing," he growled. Celine smiled, slow and knowing. "Then why are you shaking?" His grip on the stone tightened, claws biting into the ancient surface. He had fought wars, slaughtered monsters, faced death itself without flinching. But this creature beneath him, was undoing him with nothing more than a whisper, a look, the soft parting of her lips as if daring him to close the space between them. "I should kill you," he rasped. Her fingers trailed up his arm, nails grazing his skin like a promise. "Then why haven't you?" The night held its breath. Cale's heart thundered. And in that moment, he knew this wasn't a hunt. It was a fall. The night whispered between them, thick with unsaid words, heavier with something far more dangerous. The ruins stood silent, their broken walls casting jagged shadows beneath the moon's eerie glow. Cale could hear everything. The soft hitch of Celine's breath, The slow, steady pulse of her ancient heart, the faint shift of silk as her gown clung to her fevered skin. His every instinct screamed at him to act, to seize control, to end the torment of this unbearable tension. But she stood before him, bold, fearless, challenging his restraint with nothing more than a glance. Celine leaned against the cold stone, her violet eyes smoldering. "You're still holding back." Cal's jaw tightened, his hands curled into fists at his sides. He had never held back in his life. Not in battle. Not in hunger. Not in desire. But this was different. She was different. Her scent curled around him, intoxicating, laced with something unnatural, something wrong. And yet he couldn't resist it. The beast within him prowled restlessly, muscles coiling, aching to move, to claim. "You don't know what you're inviting," he growled. His voice was low, rough like the distant roll of thunder before a storm. Celine arched a delicate brow, the barest smirk teasing her lips. "Don't I?" His breath came hard through his nose. Her audacity both infuriated and thrilled him. Was she playing with him, testing the boundaries of his control? Dangerous, reckless, beautiful. He took a step forward. She didn't flinch, didn't retreat. She only tilted her chin, meeting his golden stare with the same fearless defiance that had drawn him in from the moment he'd laid eyes on her. He lifted a hand, slow, deliberate, watching her reaction. She didn't move as his fingers grazed her throat, tracing the heated pulse that shouldn't have been there. A vampire's skin should be cold, lifeless. But hers was warm, burning beneath his touch. "You're not supposed to feel this," he murmured. Her lashes lowered slightly, her breath unsteady. "And yet I do." His fingers trailed lower, following the damp path where a single bead of sweat had rolled down the curve of her collarbone. She shivered, the movement almost imperceptible. But he caught it. He felt it. A slow, satisfied growl rumbled deep in his chest. Celine's lips parted, as if to speak, but no words came. He could sense her conflict, the war waging beneath her flawless exterior. She wanted control, needed it, but Cal had never been one to surrender his dominance so easily. Not to his enemies, not to his desires. But she was both. His hand moved to the back of her neck, fingers tangling in her silver hair. She let out the softest gasp, barely a sound, but it sent a jolt of raw heat through his veins. He leaned in, until his lips were just a breath away from hers, until her scent was all he knew, until the pulse of her body matched the rhythm of his own. "This is dangerous," she whispered, but there was no fear in her voice. His lips brushed the shell of her ear, his voice dark, rough. "Then run." Silence. She didn't. His grip tightened just slightly, just enough to feel the fragile balance of power shift between them. Her fingers, ice cold against the heat of his skin, curled around his wrist, not pushing him away, but holding him there. "I don't run," she breathed. Cal's smirk was slow, predatory. "Then you're mine." The words sealed something between them, something that should never have been, something neither of them could stop. The storm crashed through the forest, sending torrents of rain against the crumbling ruins. Lightning slashed across the sky, illuminating the broken stone walls where Cal and Celine stood, their bodies dangerously close, their gazes locked in a silent war neither wanted to win. The fire in her veins had only grown worse. Celine had shed her heavy cloak long ago, but it was not enough. Sweat beaded along her porcelain skin, her breath coming in slow, measured inhales, as if she were battling something deep within. Her body, so used to cold, to endless stillness, burned as though she had been cast into the sun. Cal saw it all, and he couldn't look away. Her gown clung to her curves, the fabric soaked from the humid night air. The scent of her, sweet, intoxicating, laced with something dark and forbidden, wrapped around him like a drug. His claws flexed at his sides, the beast inside him restless, hungry. She was too perfect, too fragile, and yet he knew the danger she held within. Your body is betraying you. His voice was low, rough, filled with something unspoken. Celine leaned against the cold stone, her fingers curling over the jagged edges. It's the heat. Her voice was breathless, but not weak. It's never happened before. Cale moved closer, the heat of him radiating through the thick night air. Your kind aren't supposed to feel warmth. Her violet eyes flickered. And yours aren't supposed to want this. The words struck like a challenge. Cale was a warrior, a hunter. He was built to resist temptation, to control his instincts, to dominate his urges rather than be ruled by them. But Celine, she was undoing him with nothing but her presence. Another drop of sweat rolled down the delicate curve of her throat. His gaze followed it, his breath deepening. Her lips parted slightly. Cale. It was the first time she had said his name. The sound of it, soft, dangerous, laced with something she didn't understand, sent a bolt of hunger through him. His hand moved before he could stop it, fingers brushing against her fevered skin. She shivered, her cool touch reaching for his wrist. But she didn't pull away. His grip tightened, his thumb tracing the racing pulse beneath her jaw. Your heart is beating too fast. Her breath hitched. Yours is worse. The air between them crackled, thick with tension. The storm raged outside, the wind howling through the ruins, but neither of them moved. Celine's fingers trailed up his forearm, slow, testing. His skin burned under her touch, muscles tightening as he fought against the urge to press her back against the stone, to claim the space between them as his own. But she wasn't prey. She was something far more dangerous. A cold gust of wind swept through the ruins, lifting the silver strands of her hair, sending them brushing against his jaw. His lips parted slightly, the scent of her, dark roses and midnight temptation, making it harder to think. I should leave, she whispered, but there was no conviction in her voice. Cale leaned in, his forehead nearly touching hers. Then go. She didn't move. His fingers traced lower, ghosting over her collarbone, feeling the unnatural warmth that shouldn't have existed in her. She arched slightly beneath his touch, her breath coming quicker now, matching the rhythm of the storm outside. Her violet eyes met his, searching, challenging, daring. You want this, he murmured, his voice like gravel and sin. Celine swallowed hard. I don't fear you. Cale smirked. You should. Then, before she could speak, before either of them could break the moment, he closed the last of the distance. His lips barely brushed hers, a whisper of contact, enough to set fire to whatever had been growing between them. A sharp inhale, a pause, and then the world shattered. The moment their lips met, the world seemed to tremble. Cale hadn't meant to close the distance. He had been teetering on the edge of control, knowing that once he touched her, once he let himself taste the forbidden, there would be no turning back. But Celine, she was fire wrapped in ice, and he was already burning. Her lips were cool, yet the heat radiating from her skin betrayed her. She was changing, something unnatural stirring within her veins, something neither of them understood. Cale felt the tremor in her body, the sharp inhale as she pressed against him, caught between resistance and surrender. Then she kissed him back. It was slow at first, testing, a dangerous dance between predator and prey. But Cale wasn't gentle. His grip tightened on her waist, pulling her against his solid frame, his body radiating raw heat. Celine's hands found his chest, her nails grazing over his skin as if memorizing the way he felt beneath her fingertips. She should have feared this. She should have stopped him. But the moment his hands tangled in her silver hair, his breath hot against her skin, all reason shattered. A low growl rumbled in Cale's chest as he pressed her against the cold stone wall, his body caging hers in. His lips left hers only to trace along the delicate curve of her jaw, his breath heavy, uneven. He had fought battles, slain monsters, faced death without blinking. But this war between them was unlike anything he had ever known. Celine tilted her head back, her breath spragged. She could feel her heart pounding. a sensation she had not known in centuries. It was unnatural, impossible. And yet here she was, burning beneath his touch, craving the storm he brought with him. "I warned you," Cale murmured against her throat. Celine shivered. "And I ignored you." A dark chuckle escaped him, the sound sending another wave of heat through her. His fingers traced along the exposed skin of her collarbone, feeling the unnatural warmth that should not exist in a vampire. "You're changing," he murmured. She met his gaze, violet eyes burning with something both terrifying and intoxicating. "Because of you." The word sent a primal jolt through him. His instincts screamed at him, "This is wrong. This is dangerous." But he had already lost the fight. Celine's fingers curled into his shirt, pulling him closer. "Cale." Her voice was softer now, but laced with something deeper, something real. His breath came hard, his forehead pressing against hers. "Tell me to stop." Silence. She wouldn't. She couldn't. Instead, her lips found his again, and this time there was no hesitation, no second-guessing. It was reckless. It was madness. And yet, it was inevitable. Cale lifted her, his strength effortless, as if she weighed nothing. Her legs wrapped around his waist, her arms around his shoulders, and for the first time in his cursed life, he felt something dangerous crawl into his chest, something more terrifying than desire. Possession. He would tear the world apart for her. But the world would never allow them to have this. As the storm raged on, as their bodies pressed together in a fevered embrace, neither of them noticed the shadows moving in the distance, the eyes watching, the enemies drawing closer. They had crossed the line. And now, the hunt had begun. The air was thick with the scent of rain, sweat, and something far more dangerous. Them. Cale held Celine against him, his chest rising and falling in deep, heavy breaths. The heat between them had settled into something deeper, something that hummed in his bones like a force he could no longer resist. Her body, cool and fevered at once, fit against his like a piece he had never known was missing. But then, a shift. A sound too subtle for human ears, a presence lurking beyond the veil of night. Cale's golden eyes flickered, his senses sharpening. The storm had masked it well, but now it was unmistakable. They were being watched. Celine felt it too. Her violet eyes, hazy from their stolen moment, snapped into focus. In an instant, the seductive warmth between them was replaced by the cold, sharp edge of danger. "Move," Cale growled, his grip tightening on her waist before setting her down. His stance shifted, muscles coiling like a predator prepared to strike. Celine didn't hesitate. The fever burning inside her had not dulled her instincts, and she knew what this meant. They had been found. A flicker of movement in the darkness, then another. Cale snarled, his claws lengthening, his fangs bared. "Show yourselves." Silence. Then a voice, low, mocking, filled with venom. "How far you've fallen, Alpha." From the shadows, a figure stepped forward, the moonlight illuminating sharp features and gleaming eyes. A werewolf, lean but powerful, his presence humming with authority. Behind him, more emerged. 5, 6 wolves in human form, their expressions unreadable, their bodies radiating hostility. Celine's fingers curled at her sides. These were not just hunters. These were Cale's own kind. Cale exhaled slowly, his golden eyes burning with restrained fury. "This doesn't concern you, Rhaegar." The wolf smirked. "Oh, but it does. We smelled her filth on you." His gaze flicked to Celine, disdain twisting his features. A vampire. His lip curled. And not just any leech here. Celine's expression remained unreadable, but her fingers twitched slightly. The name she had abandoned long ago still carried weight. "Stand down," Cale warned, his voice dangerously low. Rhaegar chuckled darkly. "You think you can command us while you reek of her? You are an alpha, Cale. Our alpha. And yet here you are, corrupted, tainted, forgetting what you are." Cale's control strained. His claws flexed. He knew what this was. A challenge, a declaration. Celine moved beside him, her presence like cold fire against his burning rage. She was not afraid. Not of them. Not of this moment. You expect him to deny what's already begun, she murmured, her voice smooth as silk, but edged with steel. Rhaegar's eyes darkened. You've bewitched him. Chaol let out a low, dangerous growl. No one bewitches me. A tense silence. The air crackled with something lethal, something on the verge of breaking. Then, Rhaegar lunged. Chaol was faster. He intercepted the attack in a blur, claws colliding with flesh, a snarl ripping through the stormy night. The others moved as well, shadows shifting in the chaos, but Celine was already gone, her body dissolving into mist, reappearing behind one of the wolves. A whisper of motion, and she struck, deadly, precise. The battle was inevitable. The war had begun. And through it all, Chaol knew one thing with burning certainty. He would kill them all before he let them take her from him. The night erupted in chaos. Chaol struck first. His claws slashed through flesh, sending Rhaegar staggering back with a snarl. The scent of blood filled the air, sharp and intoxicating, mixing with the storm's dampness. The other wolves lunged, but Chaol was already moving, his instincts razor-sharp, his fury unchained. Celine was a blur of silver and shadow. She wove through the fight like mist, her movements graceful, lethal. One wolf turned toward her, teeth bared, too slow. She twisted, her fingers grazing his throat, and with a flick of her wrist, he collapsed, choking on nothing but air. Chaol saw it all, and something darkly possessive coiled in his chest. She was beautiful in battle, deadly, untouchable. The sight of her, hair wild, eyes burning, sent something primal roaring through him. She was not meant to fight beside his kind, and yet she was his, and they would all bleed for thinking otherwise. Another wolf charge. Chaol ducked low, catching the attacker midair, his claws ripping through flesh. A howl of pain echoed, cut short as he threw the body aside. Rhaegar lunged again, but Chaol was ready. He caught him by the throat, slamming him against the stone ruins. The impact cracked through the air. You think I've fallen. Chaol's voice was a low snarl, his breath ragged, golden eyes glowing. You think she is weakness. His grip tightened. Then you know nothing. Rhaegar's lips curled into a bloody smirk. She's already killing you. A sharp pain struck Chaol's side. He staggered back, his grip faltering. Celine's name burned on his tongue, but he could barely breathe. His vision blurred for half a second before he caught the glint of silver, a dagger. Silver, poisoned. The wolves had not come to challenge him. They had come to end him. Celine saw the wound before he did, her violet eyes widening. Something inside her snapped. The storm, the fight, the rest of the world, none of it mattered anymore. All that mattered was him. In a heartbeat, she was there, her body moving on instinct, her cold fingers brushing his burning skin. His blood was dark against her pale hands. Her heart clenched, a foreign ache that shouldn't exist inside her. Chaol's breath was rough, heavy, but he still growled. Don't. Celine ignored him. She turned to Rhaegar, her face a mask of cold fury. You should have killed me first. Then she moved. She was no longer mist and grace. She was wrath. Her hand shot forward, fingers curling around Rhaegar's throat. He gasped, his body going rigid, as if something unseen had sunk its claws into his very soul. Celine's eyes darkened, her voice a whisper of death itself. You will regret this. A strangled sound escaped Rhaegar's lips. His body convulsed. The air shimmered around them as if reality itself bent to her will. Then, darkness. She released him. Rhaegar collapsed. His body was still breathing, but his eyes were vacant, hollow. Celine turned, her breath unsteady. The other wolves hesitated, uncertainty flickering in their eyes. "Go," she commanded, her voice like ice, "or join him." One by one, the pack backed away. Then, as quickly as they had come, they were gone. Celine dropped to her knees beside Cale. His skin burned against hers, his breathing shallow. He was strong, stronger than any creature she had ever known. But even he couldn't fight Silver's poison forever. "Cale," she whispered, her fingers ghosting over his wound. His golden eyes met hers. Even now, even in pain, he watched her, like she was the only thing in the world that mattered. "You can't die," she murmured, something raw breaking in her voice. "I won't let you." His lips curved into a weak smirk. "Then do something about it." Celine's throat tightened. She knew what needed to be done. But if she did this, there would be no turning back. Her kind and his were never meant to be one. And yet, as she lowered her lips to his wound, as her fangs brushed his skin, she knew. They had already crossed that line. Celine hesitated, her breath trembling against his skin. Cale lay beneath her, his golden eyes burning even through the haze of pain. The silver poison was spreading, his veins darkening, his body burning up. He was strong, too strong, but even he could not fight this forever. And she was the only one who could save him. Her fangs ached, her hunger stirring, but this was different. This was not about feeding. This was about giving. Giving him something forbidden. Something that would change them both forever. "Celine," Cale rasped, his fingers curling weakly around her wrist. Even now, even bleeding, he was watching her, pulling her in like gravity itself. "Do it." She swallowed hard. "You don't understand what this will do to you." His smirk was faint but wicked. "Then show me." Something inside her broke. With a sharp inhale, she lowered her lips to his wound. The scent of his blood, wild, powerful, intoxicating, overwhelmed her senses. Her fangs pressed against his fevered skin. And then she bit. Cale tensed beneath her. His body jerked, a low growl escaping his throat, but he didn't pull away. He wouldn't. Celine's venom seeped into him, lacing through his bloodstream, intertwining with the silver's poison. It wasn't meant for his kind, this dark gift, this curse, but she was no ordinary vampire, and Cale was no ordinary wolf. She drank, not to take, but to heal. And as she did, something inside him shifted. Cale's breath hitched, his muscles tightening. Heat surged through his veins, clashing with the cold touch of her venom. His heart slammed against his ribs, his body fighting, changing. Celine could feel it. The raw power beneath his skin, the primal force that had always lived inside him, now twisting, reshaping into something more. Her fangs withdrew, her lips stained crimson. She lifted her head, her breath shallow, her body throbbing from the connection. Cale lay still for a moment. Then, his fingers twitched. His chest rose in a deep, steady breath. Golden eyes snapped open. But they weren't the same. Celine's lips parted. His gaze burned hotter, darker. The gold in his irises had deepened, flickering with an unnatural glow, something otherworldly. He moved before she could react. 1 second, she was kneeling over him. The next, she was under him. Cale had her pinned, his body thrumming with new, untamed energy. The wound on his side had vanished, as if it had never been there. His hands, hot, unrelenting, pressed into her wrists, his breath heavy against her throat. Celine shivered. He had always been strong. But this was different. "You did something to me," he murmured, his voice rough, deeper than before. Celine met his gaze, her pulse racing. "I saved you." Cale's lips curled, his grip tightening. "No," he growled. "You changed me." His head dipped lower, his mouth just inches from hers. The heat between them was unbearable, consuming. Celine's breath hitched. "Cale, I can feel you," he murmured against her skin, his voice sending a shiver down her spine. "Your power, your hunger." His fingers trailed up her arm, leaving a trail of fire in their wake. And now, you're inside me. Celine swallowed, her body betraying her with its aching need. I warned you. Cale smirked. And I ignored you. Then he kissed her. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't sweet. It was a clash of fire and ice, a battle of dominance neither wanted to lose. His hands tangled in her silver hair, pulling her closer, deeper. Celine gasped against his lips, her fingers curling into his shoulders. She could feel his pulse, her power inside him, shifting, molding into something new, something stronger. She had saved him. But in doing so, she had bound them together. Forever. The silence between them was thick with unspoken words, with the weight of what had just happened, what they had become. The night air was cool, yet Cale felt nothing but heat coursing through his veins, a wildfire ignited by her. Celine stood a few steps away, her silver hair illuminated by the moonlight, her violet eyes unreadable. She had healed him, saved him, but in doing so, she had changed him. And she knew it. Cale moved toward her, slow, deliberate. His body was no longer heavy with pain. He felt stronger, more alive than ever before. Every sense was heightened, every breath filled with the scent of her, cold, sweet, and utterly intoxicating. You should be afraid, she murmured, watching him carefully. I don't know what this will do to you. Cale chuckled, low and knowing. You think I'd fear this? He took another step closer, his golden eyes burning into hers. I fear nothing. Celine's fingers twitched at her sides, but she didn't move away. You're different now. Cale smirked. So are you. Something flickered in her gaze. Hesitation, longing, acceptance. She had tried to fight it, tried to deny what had been growing between them from the very beginning. But there was no escaping it now. They were bound. Not by magic, not by a curse, but by something far deeper. Cale reached out, his fingers brushing against hers, gentle yet commanding. He could feel the chill of her skin, a sharp contrast to the heat that radiated from him. The sensation sent a shiver down his spine, but he didn't pull away. Neither did she. You saved me, he said, his voice quieter now. Celine swallowed. I had to. Cale tilted his head. Because you care. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came. She didn't have to say it. He could feel it in the way she stood there, unguarded, vulnerable in a way she never allowed herself to be. He lifted a hand, cupping her cheek, tilting her face toward his. You belong to no one, he murmured, but you chose me. Celine exhaled, her breath cool against his skin. And what if I regret it? Cale smirked. Then why aren't you running? A slow, haunting smile touched her lips. Because I know you'd find me. His chest rumbled with quiet laughter. She was right. No matter where she went, no matter how far she tried to escape, he would always find her. And she wanted that. Celine reached up, hesitating for only a moment before placing her hand over his. His warmth spread through her, seeping into the spaces she never realized had been cold for so long. I don't know what happens now, she admitted. Cale's fingers trailed down, rushing against her pulse, a slow, steady rhythm that echoed something in him. Then we figure it out. She searched his gaze, looking for something. Fear, doubt, but there was none. Only certainty, only him. And she realized she didn't need to fight this anymore. The night stretched on, wrapping them in its quiet embrace. Whatever came next, whatever dangers awaited them, it didn't matter. Because for the first time, neither of them was alone. They had found something in each other, something forbidden, something dangerous, something worth everything.